Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 21, Heller, Part 2. The Founder's Design Destroyed in 2008. Or, the Heller hypocrites were actual textualist idiots. In 2008, Washington, D.C. prohibited handguns, allowed long guns, and required long guns be stored unloaded and locked. Dick Heller wanted a handgun for self-defense, because his hands were too small and weak to hold a shotgun, but D.C. banned handguns. Furthermore, Heller wanted to keep his gun loaded and in the open where children could play with it and accidentally kill someone, because his brain was too feeble to have any common sense, but D.C. law required guns be kept unloaded and locked. D.C. was following the Founder's design as explained in video number 20, Heller, Part 1. The Second Amendment protected a right to bear arms for militia service, to guarantee the federal government had access to state militias. All other rights regarding arms and their regulations, including how militia arms were stored in times of peace, and whether or not handguns were allowed and whether public carry was allowed, were left to the states. The 2008 Heller ruling is based on spectral evidence which pointed to words in the Second Amendment that protect a personal right to armed self-defense, written in invisible ink in the margins of the Bill of Rights, which can only be seen when exposed to the ultraviolet light that comes from the back end of a rabid jackalope. These judges who could divine this spectral evidence, who could see this invisible ink, these morons even had the gall to call themselves textualists. Textualists describe themselves as people who believe the law should be interpreted based on the plain text in the law itself, that interpretation should not be based on intention of the lawmakers, the history that gives context to that law, and so on. But how textualists actually operate, is they cherry-pick words in the law that they agree with, elevate its importance, and ignore words in the law they disagree with, and then justify it all behind the lie that they were merely following the text. Watch video number 16, The Inanity of Textualism. That video explains how textualism, even if followed with altruistic intentions, gives idiotic results. It also explains how textualism in practice is a bunch of hypocrites looking for an excuse for their hypocrisy. The Supreme Court justices who penned the spectral evidence majority opinion of the Heller decision while calling themselves textualists, shall for the rest of this video be referred to by the shorthand that is the Heller hypocrites. Do you know what you do not find mentioned anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or the Militia Act of 1792? Do you know what you won't find in any founding document ratified by the nation? You won't find any mention of a personal right to armed self-defense. You won't because the founders saw the Second Amendment as a way to arm the militia. The Constitution gives Congress the power for organizing, arming, disciplining, and governing the militia. The Constitution also states that the Army, Navy, and militias shall be subservient to the President as their Commander-in-Chief. The Militia Act of 1792 mandated a national draft for militia service, mandated universal registration, and subjugated members of the militia to the same laws as the Army, including court-martial for disobeying orders. The full text of the Second Amendment says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed." The drafting of the Constitution and its subsequent ratification was an extremely contentious process. Fist fights broke out. States threatened to not ratify the Constitution. The drafting of the Bill of Rights was equally contentious. Federalists were afraid the process to amend the Constitution so soon after ratification would cause people to lose faith in the Constitution, and they were afraid that the process would be used to relitigate the entire Constitution. When the Bill of Rights was being drafted, the states had been operating under their own state constitutions for about a decade. 5 state constitutions had no right to bear arms at all. 5 state constitutions had a right to bear arms for militia service only. Only 2 state constitutions had a right to armed self-defense. Those 10 states with no state constitutional right to bear arms or a state constitutional right to bear arms for militia service only, had state laws that regulated arms, including restricting public carry, restricting how guns and powder are stored. Those restrictions would be thrown out if the Federal Bill of Rights protected a personal right to armed self-defense. And that would give those 10 states cause to resist ratification of the Federal Bill of Rights. Had the founders written into the Federal Bill of Rights a personal right to armed self-defense, it would have conflicted with 10 out of the 12 existing state constitutions, it would have overruled gun control laws in those 10 states, and it would have given those 10 states cause to not ratify the Bill of Rights. The Federalists didn't care about a personal right to armed self-defense. They wanted federal access to state militias. The Constitution Convention was spurred on by Shays' Rebellion. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was so weak that it had no money and no militia to stop Shays, and the 4,000 men in Shays' Rebellion ran amok for 10 months before the governor of Massachusetts put together a militia to finally stop Shays and his men. The Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. One strong enough to stop rebellions like Shays. And the way they did that was to give the federal government access to state militias. See video number 4, Shays' Rebellion, for more context about how Shays' Rebellion affected the very design of the United States. See video number 5, Constitution and Bill of Rights for more information about the drafting and ratification of the Bill of Rights. But to be a textualist is to reserve the right to claim all this context and history is irrelevant to the interpretation of the law. Which is exactly what the Heller hypocrites did. They ignored this history that shows a federal right to armed self-defense wasn't the founders' intention. They ignored the history that shows that a federal right to armed self-defense would conflict with 10 out of 12 existing state constitutions. They ignored that a federal right to armed self-defense might give states cause to resist ratification. The Heller hypocrites ignored the very clear history around the drafting and ratification process of the Constitution and Bill of Rights because that history makes clear the founders wanted a federal right to bear arms for militia service, and all other questions regarding the right to bear arms were left to the states. The Heller hypocrites ignored this very relevant history because it disagreed with the interpretation they wanted. But don't think that stopped them from cherry-picking from the rest of history to find words that did agree with them. The 2008 Heller ruling can be looked at as a sweeping historical fishing expedition combined with a finely tuned and completely biased cherry-picking process to only allow history that agreed with the interpretation they wanted. The Heller ruling mentions the Magna Carta, Charles I, the House of Lords, Gentleman's Monthly Intelligencer, the Restoration, King Charles II, among others. These morons would have invoked words from ancient Sumeria if they could but read cuneiform, and if the Sumerians had text that suggested a personal right to spears for armed self-defense. But the simple and direct history of the drafting and ratification of the Constitution and Federal Bill of Rights? That, according to the Heller hypocrites, is off-limits. When Justice Stevens dissented in the Heller ruling by pointing out that James Madison's original draft of the right to bear arms included a conscientious objector clause to refuse militia service, and therefore shows the drafters intended the clause to refer to military service, the textualists wrote, "I kid you not, it is always perilous to derive the meaning of an adopted provision from another provision deleted in the drafting process." The Heller hypocrites invoke the Magna Carta from 1215 AD because they think it derives useful meaning for the Second Amendment in 1792, but these same morons argued that the first draft of the Second Amendment, written just months before it was ratified, is too perilous to derive meaning from. Textualist logic: if proposed words agree with me, they are vitally important and inform all later meanings. If proposed words disagree with me, they are perilous to pull meaning from, and just wrong. Because textualism is a con. The Heller hypocrites found text that imbued the Second Amendment with a personal right to armed self-defense written in the era of Dred Scott, by a pro-slavery, pro-secession state judge in a state ruling that significantly increased white slave owners' right to arms just 15 years before the South started the Civil War. The ruling was Nunn v. Georgia of 1846, written by a judge named Lumpkin. Watch video number 19, Nunn v. Georgia, 1846, to get all the reasons Nunn v. Georgia is garbage. Lumpkin wanted to arm white slave owners, but Georgia would not have a state Bill of Rights until 15 years after the Nunn case. Georgia had no state right to bear arms at the time of the Nunn ruling. So Lumpkin looked to the Second Amendment and imbued it with the rights he wanted to grant. Lumpkin cherry-picked 3 cases from states with a state right to armed self-defense. Lumpkin also ignored that one of the cases he invoked actually upheld a gun control law despite that state having a right to armed self-defense. Lumpkin ignored the historical context that when the Second Amendment was drafted, only 2 states had an explicit right to armed self-defense, and ignored that 10 states had no right to bear arms or a right to bear arms for militia service only. One might read the Declaration of Independence's right to life, and infer some natural right to self-defense. But Lumpkin runs with it and asserts not only a natural right to armed self-defense, but also legislates from the bench as he converts a natural right to self-defense into an absolute, unlimited, legal right to armed self-defense. That's not how natural rights work. It is the job of Congress to figure out where your natural right to swing your fist ends, and where the right of justice for all recognizes someone else's nose begins. Not judges. But that's exactly what Lumpkin did in his Nunn ruling. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. John Locke. Watch video number 18, Natural right to self-defense is not a constitutional right to self-destruct, to see the significant differences between a natural right and a legal right. Lumpkin was all kinds of wrong in Nunn. But Lumpkin said the words the Heller hypocrite textualists wanted to hear, so they quoted his ruling and hold it as divine authority. The Heller ruling referenced Nunn v. Georgia, not once, not twice, but 5 different times, without so much as a whiff of awareness that maybe the Nunn ruling was tainted based on who ruled it, when he ruled it, and the fact that several amendments render that pro-slavery nonsense to be obsolete and disqualified for being used as precedent in a case from 2008. Here is an excerpt from Heller. In Nunn v. Georgia, 1846, the Georgia Supreme Court construed the Second Amendment as protecting the natural right of self-defense and therefore struck down a ban on carrying pistols openly. Its opinion perfectly captured the way in which the operative clause of the Second Amendment furthers the purpose announced in the prefatory clause, in continuity with the English right. The right of the whole people, old and young, men, women and boys, and not militia only, to keep and bear arms of every description, and not such merely as are used by the militia, shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon, in the smallest degree. To be clear, Lumpkin, the pro-slavery, pro-secession, white supremacist, activist judge behind the Nunn v. Georgia decision did not perfectly capture anything about the Second Amendment. Lumpkin wrote something the textualists agreed with, and so the hypocrite textualists then simply accept all these words as sacred and ignore everything else. Starting from a natural right to self-defense, Lumpkin fabricates the idea that everyone has an absolute legal right to armed self-defense, and this absolute legal right demands access to any weapon of any kind imaginable, arms of every description, and those arms cannot be regulated in the smallest degree. This is nonsense. This isn't how natural rights work. Lumpkin legislated from the bench, and used natural rights to justify it. Watch video number 18 for more details about natural rights versus legal rights. Watch video number 11, Categories of Weapons for the Militia versus Full-Time Army, to see why Lumpkin's arms of every description idea is complete garbage. Even if Nunn v. Georgia of 1846, a state ruling by a state judge somehow established precedent that the Supreme Court was bound to follow, which it doesn't, that precedent was overruled and rendered null and void by 1874, U.S. v. Cruikshank, which unanimously ruled that the Second Amendment did not establish any explicit personal right to bear arms, that individuals must look to their states for those individual rights. But the Heller hypocrites do not care about precedent when precedent disagrees with the ruling they want. Because, and apologies if this was mentioned before, textualism is a con. There are 200 years of cases where state and federal judges upheld the notion that the Second Amendment is only a right to bear arms for militia service only. There are 200 years of history where states regulated arms outside of militia service. But the Heller hypocrites cherry-picked the singular case in Nunn v. Georgia because it had words the Heller textualists wanted to hear. The Heller hypocrites held the Nunn words as divinely inspired, and the Heller hypocrites ignored 2 centuries of cases that ruled any other way. So the Heller hypocrites simply ignored precedent that said the Second Amendment guaranteed no explicit personal right to bear arms, and then fabricated from the 800-year-old ghost of the Magna Carta, from the ghost of Charles I, from some moldy copy of Gentleman's Monthly Intelligencer, and from a badly interpreted version of the Restoration, these ghost hunters extracted the spectral evidence that proved to themselves that, actually, the Second Amendment very much does establish a personal right to armed self-defense, even though the Constitution and Bill of Rights itself contains no such words, all while claiming themselves to be textualists who only read the plain words in the law. In short, the Heller hypocrites lied. And they used "we are textualists who just follow the text" to justify their lying. And if we want to look at the right to bear arms from a grammatically nitpicky way, on par with the operative clause of the Second Amendment furthers the purpose announced in the prefatory clause nonsense, then another important pattern is how the early draft to a right to bear arms contained 3 separate clauses. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. This draft used 3 separate sentences, meaning, from a grammatically point of view, that there are 3 separate, unrelated rights in play. 1. A right to bear arms. 2. A militia is for defense of state. 3. Conscientious objectors cannot be compelled to serve in the militia. But the next draft put them all together, because the founders saw them all connected. A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed, but no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms, shall be compelled to render military service in person. That version put everything into a single sentence, which grammatically speaking, is what you do if the thing you are talking about is all one thing, instead of, say, 3 separate things. This version points to a right to bear arms for militia service, but militia service comes with a religious exemption. The final draft removed the religious exception for militia service. Possibly because they didn't want to make a law regarding religion in the same document that said Congress shall make no law regarding religion. But they kept the single sentence format. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. So, these different drafts point to the idea that this wasn't talking about 3 separate, unrelated rights, but a single right, a right to bear arms for militia service. Even in the smaller details, the Heller hypocrites twist themselves into legal pretzels trying to legislate from the bench. One logic pretzel in Heller is in the quote above. Its opinion perfectly captured the way in which the operative clause of the Second Amendment furthers the purpose announced in the prefatory clause. The Heller hypocrites are engaging in grammar-based revisionism here. Their argument here boils down to the assertion that the first half of the Second Amendment is irrelevant to the second half. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. According to the morons behind Heller, the founders were merely rambling when they wrote the first half about militias being needed for a free state, and that the only operational text is the second half which says the right of the people shall not be infringed. This is basically Billy Bob Hayseed, in a black robe, shouting, "What part of shall not be infringed do you not understand?" Even better, this is a bunch of textualists ignoring the defining part of the text. Here's some text for you. Once upon a time, there was a king, who wanted a souffle for his birthday celebration. The king's chef posted an order outside the kitchen. The king's souffle, being an important part of his birthday tonight, everyone who enters the kitchen must wear padded shoes and tread lightly. A century later, the king's great-granddaughter sits on the throne as queen. The queen's secretary-general is a self-important little jackalope, a complete raving lunatic, with the IQ of a rotten tomato. In the court historical records, he finds the order from the chef from a century ago, and says to himself, "The operative clause of the order furthers the purpose announced in the prefatory clause." He posts a new order on the door to the Queen's kitchen: all who enter the kitchen must wear padded shoes and tread lightly. The Queen's Secretary-General is a moron, as idiotic as the Heller hypocrites. Tread lightly, in this story, is an order tied to a very specific circumstances, to the time while the chef is making the King's birthday soufflé. Bearing arms, in the Second Amendment, is a right tied to a very specific circumstance, to militia service. A militia, being important to maintain a free state, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Anyone who says the King's chef wanted people to tread lightly in the Queen's kitchen a century later, they are either raging morons, or willfully misreading the text. If they call themselves textualists, then they're both. Because textualist idiots will try to tell you that the history that gives context to why the King's chef put the order outside the kitchen, making one soufflé for the King's birthday, must be ignored when reading the text of the law. But the story is what makes clear the intentions of the order. And because textualist idiots will tell you that only they can interpret the text in question. And what they do is make textualist excuses to justify ignoring text they disagree with, where in any other circumstance would call such a person a raging hypocrite. The Heller hypocrites are deliberately misreading the Second Amendment. They are deliberately ignoring the context of history that makes clear the founders intended for the federal right to bear arms to be tied to militia service. Yet they mount a fishing expedition through the rest of history to find text that can be bent to agree with their idiocy. They are deliberately ignoring the precedent of the Cruikshank ruling that made clear the Second Amendment did not guarantee any personal right to bear arms, that those rights are left to the states, and they choose to hold a state case, none, by a state judge, which does not bind the Supreme Court in any way, and hold it as binding. Textualism is a con job. And the Heller hypocrites make this abundantly clear. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.